An embattled President Donald Trump may have harvested some dividends of a constructive dialogue with his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping. However, old policymakers of the Obama administration may refuse to give up their established perception about the alleged China threat in Northeast Asia. The priority issue for American scholars here at the World Peace Forum of Tsinghua University in Beijing remains the denuclearization issue in the DPRK. They even ask if China would agree to a low-level joint military adventure to address the issue of tensions in the divided Korean Peninsula. They admit that Chinese mainland's diplomatic ties with Panama was indeed a big shock, and they argue that more of the U.S. generals might be sent to Taiwan according to the Authorization Act of the U.S. Congress. To address these and other issues, we are glad to be joined in the first part of the interview by Mr. Daniel Russell, former Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, but currently he is a Senior Research Fellow with the Asia Society. When we come back after the short break, we'll be joined by Mr. Roy David Kamphausen, Senior Vice President of Research at the National Bureau for Asia Affairs. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
It's been the case for years for the United States that the newly elected president would adopt a logic like anything but Bush, anything but Clinton, anything but Obama. Now, during the Obama administration, back to Asia, strategy of reassurance, smart diplomacy, you look at those diplomatic and political rhetoric employed by the Obama administration, particularly your former boss, Secretary Clinton. Mm-hmm. Now, the Chinese got a strong feeling that we are in a collision course with the United States and there must be clashes. In fact, you said that based on the current trajectory war between the two countries, China and the United States, in the decades is not just possible but much more likely than recognized at the moment. What's your current perception? Can you share with us?
No, I don't believe, and I don't think I ever believed that war between US-China is inevitable. Moreover, I think today in 2017, there's a moment which has never been seen in history before in which the economic interests of the two largest countries in the world are so intertwined. This means that we have some significant areas of friction, but it also means that we have very, very strong bonds that connect us. Moreover, I think that the officials and leaders on both sides should be proud of the effort that both Beijing and Washington has put into establishing meaningful channels of dialogue. Now, presidents change. I was in handling Asia when China moved from President Hu Jintao to President Xi Jinping. We've just seen the election of a new president, Donald J. Trump. But whereas the occupant of the White House or Zhou Enlai may change, the interests of the nation, of China and the United States, remain largely constant. And what matters is our ability to have the kind of candid, honest dialogue that allows for the presentation of differences, of concerns, of complaints, that allows the Chinese side to understand what's driving the Americans and vice versa. So today at this conference we heard from Zhang Yesui, the Executive Vice Foreign Minister, who was first the Chinese permanent representative of the UN and then the ambassador to Washington, and someone I very much respect. I worked with Zhang Yesui and with then Vice Foreign Minister Cui Tiankai to set up the Sunnylands meeting between China's new president and Barack Obama. And in that meeting, among the many important things that the two leaders decided was a commitment to deal honestly and candidly directly with the areas of difference. It's easy to talk about what you agree on. It's awkward often to talk about what you disagree on. And when leaders talk about areas of disagreement, sometimes it's an argument, sometimes it's a dialogue of the deaf. The US-China relationship has made I think, significant strides in increasing our ability to talk, to engage, and to follow through and follow up through mechanisms. In the Bush administration, it was the strategic economic dialogue. In the Obama administration, it was the strategic and economic dialogue, 2 tracks. Now the Bush team has divided into 4 tracks. It isn't the format that matters, it's the discussion. It's the ability of the leaders to reach an understanding at a strategic level about what it is they're trying to accomplish. And it's about the senior officials working on an iterative, ongoing basis to try to get that done.
Allegedly, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century used to be characterized by 3 C's, cooperation, competition, and confrontation. Today, do you think we should take a second look at yet another 3 important letters, 3 M's, misunderstanding, miscommunication, and mismanagement? Do you think during the Obama administration, either side, the American government or, in some likelihood, the Chinese authorities may have delivered a wrong message to the other side, or a right message has been misunderstood? And this misperception has been unfortunately reinforced by the media, which arouses much of the nationalist sentiment on our side, and perhaps on your side. You are afraid of having the Thucydides trap, inevitable clashes between the existing power and the rising power. Could you possibly cite one example to illustrate, yes, indeed, we have had some very serious misunderstanding?
Well, I don't think that misunderstanding is the right way to...
We may add another M, mistrust.
Well, misunderstandings and mistrust are challenges that we deal with and have to struggle to overcome. They don't characterize the relationship. Those aren't the hallmarks of the relationship. The relationship that the U.S. wants to have with China is one that is in fact marked by the C's, which are competition, communication, but also cooperation, importantly cooperation. And there are different kinds of competition. There is sports and business, a healthy competition where the rules are applied equally to all participants. There's strategic competition, and by that I'm referring to what Graham Allison and others, and for that matter President Xi Jinping, has called the Thucydides trap. There's the U.S.-China relationship has been, is now, and will be challenged by a wide range of forces that can create real turbulence or worse.
Perhaps the military-industrial complex on your side may be a lobby group that you find it very difficult to dismiss. That
wasn't my experience in government at all.
It wasn't your experience?
It was not my experience. I am more confident than that in the sense that I think that there is a positive disposition towards China in the United States.
Okay, here are 2 flashpoints in East Asia. You are an expert of East Asian studies and a very senior advisor to President Obama, currently senior post in Asia Today, Asia Society. Kim Jong-un kept testing missiles, nuclear warheads. Now, it seems China always comes under fire from the other side. Japanese, Americans, and even South Koreans for not doing enough to persuade the regime in the DPRK to give up its nuclear ambition, nuclear capability. But China says we want to maintain stability and peace in the Korean Peninsula in the first and foremost position. So what do you think of China's priority issue for the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I see both sides of the argument, and I'm very sympathetic to the Chinese concern about a meltdown on its own border. That's a legitimate concern. I think that it's easy for Americans to overlook the fact China is strongly committed to the denuclearization of North Korea. That's not the only priority for China in strategic terms. where you stand on an issue is where you sit. In other words, the perspective from Washington is to some degree different than the perspective from Beijing. Kim Jong-un is threatening the United States with nuclear attack by intercontinental ballistic missiles. If you're in Washington, D.C., that threat takes precedence over the risk of a little bit of environmental contamination from fallout from an accident at Penghu. But, Mr. Young, the critical thing is the United States and China cannot make North Korea a test of wills between the two of us, or else Kim Jong-un will win. We have got to find a way to reconcile China's own strategic interests with those of the United States, as well, frankly, as those of the Republic of Korea and, to some extent, Russia and Japan.
Do you believe the ongoing, and I believe the first round of a DSD, diplomatic and security dialogue between the two governments, will help find a solution to what you call the strategic patience over the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula?
Well, one meeting won't do the trick, but it is an essential condition to finding a way forward that we talk about strategy at a senior or official level. But talking, as I said, isn't good enough. We have to be listening. And we have to be exploring how we can deal with a dynamic and evolving threat. You know, the old way of looking at North Korea, even from Beijing, is no longer valid. Kim Jong-un has insulted, challenged, and ignored China's interests.
And the young man, Otto Warmbier, has been killed. And that's a tragic death, tragedy for the family, and perhaps a very serious wake-up call for the American government. What would the Trump administration do to punish the regime? Or you would just have yet another round of discussion at the UN Security Council to pass economic sanctions?
Well, there's no excuse for the brutal treatment of the American citizen Otto Warmbier, and it is to think that a promising and talented young college student was abused and treated so horribly that he was sent back in a coma and almost immediately died. The bigger national security issue, though, although the Warmbier case sheds a lot of light on North Korea's gross disregard for human rights, the bigger strategic issue is that North Korea is developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that threaten the United States as they threaten Japan, South Korea, and in the view of people like Henry Kissinger, threaten China as well. This is a challenge that requires Washington and Beijing to work together to meet that danger.
There's a lot to be done by both sides jointly. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mr.
I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Welcome back. We are joined in the second part of the interview by Mr. Roy David Camphausen, Senior Vice President and Director, the Washington, D.C. office at the National Bureau of Asian Research, the United States of America. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. With the successful conclusion of the DSD negotiations between the United States and China, what do you think will be the solution to the Korean crisis? I mean, the Korean Peninsula crisis about denuclearization and missile tests.
Well, it's a complex and challenging time. My sense of the new Moon administration is that they want to move back from the brink of confrontation. Before he was elected, I met with a number of his advisors, and the sense is that they thought they were being rushed to a point, that Korea was being rushed to a point of confrontation that the people of South Korea were not ready for. And so one has a sense that the Moon administration wants to reevaluate. But that comes at a time when we see increasing pressure on American leaders to, quote unquote, do something about the maturing missile and nuclear program in North Korea. I think my sense is the Trump administration wanted to see some early progress and hoped that the President Xi Jinping and President Trump dialogue in Florida in early April might help to yield such an outcome. But that was perhaps overly optimistic on their part. The fundamentals remain the same. North Korea sees its nuclear missile program as, in part, a security guarantee against military strikes. And China can't think about the end of the DPRK because it's a useful buffer on its northeastern border, even if the Chinese leadership really doesn't care very much for Kim Jong-un and the DPRK regime.
That's the American reckoning, I'm afraid. Now, what do you think of the progress, if any, in the negotiations about the prospects of having more of the THAAD deployment under our nose, on our steps? Because that has caused a strong rebound of nationalist sentiment for the media and for the ordinary folks in China.
I've never understood that. In my 25 years of engaging with Chinese interlocutors on security issues, this position is the position I least understand from my Chinese friends and counterparts. That is a missile defense system that's oriented toward the north. I've been part of dialogues with Chinese counterparts in which its limitations with regard to seeing China were pretty well discussed. It really is, it's hard for me to understand. I understand that it is an emotional issue, but the basis of that, I don't really can't
It's based
grasp.
on our worries that THAAD is likely to offset the balance of terror. It's part of the NMD that was first handed down from the Reagan administration, which in 1983 put forward the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. That may have somehow led to the arms race and drained the Soviet coffer, leading to the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Having said this, the missile shield programs have indeed caused many controversies, be they in Poland or Czech republics to target the Russian Federation, or in East Asia. These are the Chinese concerns from the Chinese perspective. So do you understand?
You know, China has ever since it developed its nuclear deterrent in the early 1960s, had a very mature and forward-looking approach to the value of nuclear weapons, which is to say, you don't need many of them, you just need the ability to have a second strike capability. And frankly, the Cold War period between the United States and Soviet Union saw a vast waste of resources in pursuit of larger and larger nuclear stockpiles. China's position has not been that. And so in this respect, it is surprising to me that China would take a view that somehow its capacity is limited against the United States when this is a short-range air defense and radar system.
Do you think as a student of a former South Korean president who won the Nobel Prize for Sunshine Policy, will return to what has been experimented between the two Koreas, for example, reopening the Kaohsiung industrial city or industrial park, if you like? What do you think of the prospect of resuming the inter-Korean negotiations or even their joint ventures economically?
Well, they've certainly made sounds as though they might pursue that sort of reopening. I think there's two ways to think about it. First, he must be very sensitive to what the Korean people want. And the polling is a quite mature process in South Korea now. And so President Moon will have to pay close attention to that in terms of how he proceeds. But secondly, I'm personally of a view that more contact with the South is better in terms of potentially opening up the North. And so I don't regard the the various opening opportunities as a reward or punishment, so to speak, but rather as an opportunity. And so it's hard to know how the Trump administration will regard those that potential opportunity, but I hope they take a longer-term view on it.
Let's look at Taiwan. Madam Tsai Ing-wen, the newly elected leader in Taiwan, went through the first year of her leadership without submitting a very satisfactory examination paper to the mainland regarding the One China principle, or you may call it the 1992 consensus about the One China principle. On the other hand, the economic performance was appallingly poor, and the approval rating was extremely low, or is extremely low. The southbound economic policy may have paid off to some degree, but what do you think of having said this, what do you think of the recent establishment of diplomatic relationship between Panama and China that has really put the frog in the hot water, so to speak? And some of the American policymakers even suggested that you increase the level of male-to-male ties with the island. Do you think that's likely to lead to mounting tensions between Washington and Beijing?
Well, certainly Panama's decision was a shock to the leadership in Taiwan, in Taipei. And I'm sure they will think of the importance of working with the remaining countries that recognize Taiwan. The Congress, as you note, has suggested in the Authorization Act that higher level contact between the U.S. and Taiwan ought to be considered. Now, the Congress can't mandate that. They can only suggest it. It's still the policy of the administration. But they certainly have more political cover to pursue such opportunities, including potentially a visit of general officers or flag admirals to Taiwan, which hasn't occurred since derecognition in 1979. The U.S. and China understand the stakes, and they won't allow, the leaders won't allow it to escalate to the point where there's direct confrontation. But we may see some rocky times ahead.
The male-to-male balance has really tipped in favor of the mainland after decades of rapid military build-up, and therefore any prospects of having hostile confrontation between the two sides would be crazy, and that's perhaps what you call the stakes that the two sides, U.S. and China, clearly understand. Therefore, that will not be allowed to happen. What do you think of the 100-day plan by President Xi Jinping after he came back from a Mar-a-Lago summit, where he seemed to have a very constructive dialogue with his American counterpart, President Trump? Will that be used as a strong bargaining chip to help create jobs and reduce trade deficit and do more to promote mutual understanding and mutual trust?
Well, it was quite risky for both presidents to agree to that early meeting. In the United States, we were concerned that President Trump did not have the full slate of advisors in position, and there wasn't the consideration of there was a very rushed consideration of how we ought to proceed bilaterally. They knew they wanted to do things differently than the Obama administration had done with China, but they weren't entirely sure, and so it was a very short period of time. For China's perspective, it's quite risky for President Xi Jinping to come to America in the year of the 19th Party Congress. And so I think the two leaders really conveyed confidence to each other and to their peoples that they were willing to do this in their own ways. And so in that respect, it was a very positive development, I would say. But I wonder if putting a timeline on it was perhaps an artificial constraint that maybe set the scene for unmet expectations. We certainly hope that the new mechanisms, the 4 new mechanisms that have been put into place, will yield the kinds of results that will help us bilaterally manage our challenges. But I imagine we'll see some hiccups along the way there as well. And so we're optimistic, but it's still very, very, very early in the process.
The last question might be viewed more philosophically about who has contributed to the militarization of the South China Sea. We are treating accusations with the United States. Okay, you sent in the warships, and even the CNN crew was taken aboard to supervise the reclamation. And China says we would be here to provide public services despite the construction of airports. So when dust settles with the campaign success of President Duterte, it seems waters here are pretty quiet. But do you think the issue of militarization will remain hot potato?
It will remain an issue. You know, President Xi Jinping said in his bilateral meeting with President Obama that China would not militarize, but didn't further explain how he would define the term. And so American pundits were quick to look for any new evidence and said, well, this is evidence that China is militarizing. But as you note, American military activity has continued as well. I think the difference is, at least the maritime patrols are long-standing practice. You could argue that the timing had become more political, and I think that's a fair argument. The publicity had become more political, and I think that's fair as well. But I think this issue will remain for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate it.